Both Persona and Final Fantasy are considered to be legendary within the gaming world, specifically the RPG genre of gaming. And I don't know, it seems like those two IPs are among the AAA IPs that stand out the most in this day and age because of the longevity of each. And and there are a lot of people who are divided on which particular um, franchise is better. You know, whether it's Persona, whether it's Final Fantasy, and honestly, I feel like it really depends on preference because I feel like Persona, for the most part, has evolved a lot since its inception back in the mid 90s. And the thing is, Persona 1 and 2 don't get talked about hardly ever. And obviously, I guess like Atlas has done everything they can to distance themselves from the first two games, and that's mainly because the second game was highly controversial, and the first game, Persona Revelations, is one that was bigger in Japan than it was in the Americas. Because I don't remember anyone in the Americas talking about the original Persona game because there were way more popular IPs out at that time during the PS1 era, and you just look at Final Fantasy and when it peaked. A lot of people go on record and tell you it peaked back in the late '90s with Final Fantasy VII from 1997 on the PS1 because that game ended up being a massive commercial success, and it spawned some of the most iconic characters that we have seen within the gaming world, and Cloud Strife and Tifa Lockhart, and then you have Sephiroth as the main villain. And the thing is, Square Enix is still making money off of Final Fantasy VII and milking that IP to this day with the remakes and the rebirth game and all that other stuff, because it seems like the newer Final Fantasy games aren't really clicking with casuals, or it's not really clicking with gamers as it should. And I think Final Fantasy 15 would probably be the only exception because that game actually did pretty well and it was actually good for its time. But the thing is, that game came out back in 2016. I believe that was the same year Persona 5 came out. And it seems like Persona 5 stands out more than Final Fantasy 15, despite the fact that Final Fantasy 15 sold more overall. Because I think Final Fantasy 15, when it came out, it sold more than 10 million copies. And that's actually good because it sold more than Final Fantasy games that came before it. It sold more than Final Fantasy 13. And and a lot of people would go on record and tell you that even though Final Fantasy 13 um, did pretty well in terms of sales because it did over like 6.5 mil, a lot of people will go on record and probably tell you that that was the beginning of, I guess, the Final Fantasy series going downhill because I remember a lot of people being upset with part one of Final Fantasy 13 because you could only control one character in the entire party, but then they fixed that with part two. And besides, I think Lightning as a character was not nearly as popular as the characters that came before her, like the Gull Wings or Cloud Strife or any of them. But at the same time, Final Fantasy 13 was way better than the original version of Final Fantasy 14, which was heavily botched, when it was released back in 2010. And it was so bad that they had to re-release it in 2012 as a Realm Reborn. And I honestly feel like Final Fantasy as an IP never fully recovered from, the original Final Fantasy 14 game because of how badly botched it was. And I remember back in the early 2000s, I want to say 2002, when it came out with Final Fantasy 11, Square Enix took a chance by making that game an MMORPG, and it didn't really click with casuals. It really didn't click with hardcore gamers, and it's something that is just forgettable for the most part. So I honestly feel like there were definitely there's definitely missteps on the part of Square Enix that has led to decline in popularity of the Final Fantasy series as a whole. Then you have Final Fantasy 16, which came out back in 2023, I want to say. That did like 3 mil in terms of sales shortly after its release. And since then, I haven't really heard much about it. And it seemed like it's become much of an afterthought. But to be fair, 2023 was a it was pretty stacked in terms of high profile releases to a point where it just got overshadowed. So I feel like Final Fantasy 16 could have shined more if it came out in 2022 or 2024, but that's neither here or there. The point is, Final Fantasy is not nearly as popular as it once was. Granted, it's still a massive IP, it's a household name, and almost everyone's familiar with it. When it comes down to anything Final Fantasy related that gets people's attention, the only thing that comes to mind is anything involving Final Fantasy VII. Like, the Final Fantasy VII remake was actually pretty big back in 2020, and I think it's coming to the Switch too in the future, and that's something that's gotten a lot of headlines because Final Fantasy VII is widely considered to be the best installment in the entire series, and it's one of those things where a lot of people look back at all the Final Fantasy games that we have gotten over the past several years, and they believe that like the best entries came during the PS1, PS2 era because it seemed like after I guess like the after the 2000s, like um that particular franchise has been declining in popularity, which is strange because I feel like RPGs nowadays are more popular than it's ever been. But obviously, Square Enix have tried to do something different with Final Fantasy, and they try to take more of a realistic approach in relation to gameplay by making it an action RPG and diverting away from the traditional role plays playing RPG formula that made Final Fantasy popular to begin with. And I do feel like it does work with Final Fantasy VII remake and all that stuff, but at the same time, I don't know. I just feel like Square Enix hasn't been able to make anything completely new, distant from Final Fantasy VII that has really managed to click with casuals and hardcore gamers. But at the same time, there is a lot of like gamers in general who are pretty much boycotting AAA video games because a lot of what AAA video games developers have been putting out have been slop for the most part. They've been money grabs. They've been overpriced, and people are sick of it for the most part. And it's one of those things where indie RPGs like Claire Obscure Expedition 33, they're winning Game of the Year awards for the most part and being noticed as like among the best RPGs that we've seen in years. And that's not a good thing for the most part in relation to I guess like AAA games versus indie games because I feel like AAA games should be the trendsetters and the indie games should be trying to duplicate what AAA video game developers have been putting out. And it seems like the roles are reversed. Now, Persona, like the last major Persona game that we've gotten, or the last major entry we got was back in 2016 with Persona 5. And then we kind of got an extension of that with Persona 5 Royal with which I think came out back in 2020. Um, Persona 5 is widely considered to be the best installment in the entire Persona series. And and a lot of people didn't think it was possible that that game could be better than Persona 4 from 2008. And we're still waiting for Persona 6. That game hasn't even been like announced or really talked about by Atlas as of yet. But I feel like right now there's way more anticipation for Persona 6 than there is for Final Fantasy 17 because I feel like Final Fantasy 16 is pretty much an afterthought at this point because a lot of people found the main character of Final Fantasy 16 unlikable and just annoying for the most part. And I feel like just making that game rated M was kind of awkward because it just I don't know, like Final Fantasy historically has been like rated T for the most part. So just adding profanity and, more blood, gore, and violence and stuff like that doesn't necessarily make it a better game because Final Fantasy doesn't necessarily cater to the adult audience. It's it mainly caters to like both children and adults, or mainly just teenagers for the most part. Um, and you got to realize that when it comes to like M-rated games that are mainly for like adults in general, they're going to be more picky and more critical of everything. So honestly, I feel like Final Fantasy would have been better off, or Final Fantasy 16 would have been better off just catering to, I guess, kids or teenagers or what have you. And and yeah, I mean, I honestly feel like, Persona 5 is objectively a better game than Final Fantasy um 15. And the thing is, well, not better than 15, sorry, better than 16. um 15 and Persona 5 are about on the same level in terms of popularity. It's definitely a better game than Final Fantasy 16. It's more memorable, for the most part, because people are waiting for a sequel, and it's been like 10 years since Persona 5 came out. And I mean, you look at like, P5, you look at the aesthetics, you look at the gameplay, it actually feels like you're playing a video game. Everything looks much more polished. And I feel like the characters are more memorable, the storytelling's on point, and it's something that people would consider keeping. Like it seemed like one of those games that would be almost impossible to find at a used video game store. I feel like if I go to like a used video game store, I'd find multiple copies of Final Fantasy 16, and that should never really be the case. And and yeah, I mean, like Final Fantasy 16 selling like only like 3 mil or whatever, within like a year or so. That's not really a good look, especially for an IP that has been as popular and prominent as it's been over the past couple of decades, because the Final Fantasy franchise has managed to sell over 207 million units, since its inception back in the late 80s. And Persona as an IP has managed to sell more than 27 million, video games worldwide. So obviously, Final Fantasy is a bigger IP and more popular by a wide margin, but like I honestly feel like the latest games haven't really been that good. The last, I guess, good Final Fantasy game that we've gotten is Final Fantasy 15. And before that, I'd probably say that the last really good Final Fantasy game we got was 12, and I think we had gotten a remake for Final Fantasy 12 Zodiac Age not too long ago. So obviously, Square Enix is trying to make as much money off of their older IPs as they can. And I don't know if that's really like a good sign for Square Enix or not, but to go on record and to say that Persona is better than Final Fantasy is not entirely true, because I honestly feel like Final Fantasy um, has more entries, has more games that you could look back and say has had like massive commercial success and has sold more than anything that we've seen like with Persona. Like I think Final Fantasy 7 alone has sold more than like Persona 5, and the Persona series didn't start like really getting popular in America until like Persona 3. I mean, it really blew up in popularity after Persona 4. Persona 3 came out in '06, and Persona 4 came out like in '08. And then we started getting anime movies or series for those two back in the early teens. So yeah, I honestly feel like during the teens decade, the Persona series really started like getting more and more popular. But saying what's better is different than saying what's more popular. I feel like nowadays, Persona games have been more memorable and has had like lasting appeal than Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is obviously more popular, but it's to a point now where a lot of people are starting to think that Final Fantasy in general is just overrated, because I don't know. It's just that you don't have, memorable characters like what we used to have. I feel like the more recent games divert too much away from what made it popular. Because I know with Final Fantasy 16, they try to go for the whole medieval vibe and all that stuff. But one of the reasons why Final Fantasy 15 was a success is because it was more modern themed. Just like Persona 5, it was more rooted in the present opposed to something that was rooted in like medieval times that was unrelatable and just, convoluted for the most part. So yeah, I mean, in terms of which is more appealing in this day and age, I'd probably go on record and say Persona. But in terms of which IP is more popular overall, I would have to say Final Fantasy, hands down.